January 5th, 2025. We are in 2025. Hard to believe at this point, but we are getting the new year going in the right way with a weekend live stream. We had our Friday Q&A, our Saturday Q&A, and now our Sunday live stream lecture as per usual. Fridays at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, Saturdays at 7, and Sundays at 4. And for the next hour or so, I will be discussing some very important history with you in our live stream lecture, which hopefully one day will evolve into the Friendly Neighborhood History Podcast, where we'll talk about all sorts of historical topics on a weekly basis or something like that in a more organized, formatted way and things like that. And this is what we do here at the Friendly Neighborhood Podcast, our weekend live streams, where we always have 2 Q&As followed by a live stream lecture. And the live stream lecture was born out of the fact that I would do Q&As, and oftentimes people would show up and have so many great questions and everything that we would just never have the time. We would never have the time to get to all the topics that I actually wanted to discuss. I was planning to discuss them on the Q&A if things were quiet and people weren't asking questions. Hello, welcome. But because people had so many great questions and had so many great things, we expanded. We got 2 live stream Q&As. Yes, I do. And we got two live stream Q&As. And of course, we also got and we have our live stream lectures now. So Friday, Saturday, Sundays, 3 opportunities for you to come and join the Friendly Neighborhood History channel and learn some history with us, ask questions, bring up topics you would like to talk about, and interact in the chat with my wonderful moderators like No Step on Snake, who just started his own YouTube channel and had his first video released last night. So please subscribe to his YouTube channel. He did an excellent short on Pearl Harbor that I really, really enjoyed. Really, really great stuff there. Nice videos, nice optics, good information, all of that stuff. Really detailed, nice facts. So please show some love to No Step on Snake and go subscribe to his YouTube channel. I think it's got a different name than your actual personal account. So if you want to drop that in the chat, No Step on Snake, I'd be happy to support you. Please check that out. But you've got also my wonderful moderator, Simon the Bunny, and he always holds down the fort for us. So show him some love, and you guys can interact and talk with him, ask questions about the channel, learn more. We've got our social media handles, which I know Simon will put in the chat, as well as our Patreon and Substack, where I'm usually writing articles and different history blog posts and things like that, and also uploading exclusive content on Patreon for those of you who really want to get involved in the channel and help us out with a donation. So yeah, I think it's friendly history. It's friendly history on Patreon and or on Substack and on Patreon. I just think it's there. The website. Oh, there's the link to it. So I'm going to pin that message. So if you guys want to take a look at the Patreon, there is free subscriptions, but there is $5 friendly historian, and then there's a $10 best friend historian subscription that you can get, where basically you get more exclusive content, shout outs, video topics of your choice, different things, dedications, and shout out to my subscribers, Rich MA, Henry Wright, and Jordana Ballet Peace. I appreciate all of your support and everything you guys do for the channel and things like that. So obviously those are my Patreonies. So join that group right now, and join the Friendly Neighborhood Historian, the near legion that we have here on YouTube, by liking and subscribing. If you like learning about history and enjoy social studies, geopolitics, social sciences, past and present, live stream lectures, my daily videos, my short form and long form content, both of which are available. I just finished a series where I read the Christmas Carol and dipped my toes into narration. So we're becoming more and more eclectic here on the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. That's why I have this smoking jacket, to be a little bit more presentable, a little more formal wear on the channel and stuff like that. So really enjoy doing that. So check out my narrations, check out my long form videos about the holidays, and check out my short form stuff that I'm uploading daily. I really appreciate it. It's because of you guys that we're able to keep the channel going. So consider liking and subscribing and becoming a Friendly Neighborhood Historian here on YouTube. We are about 70 people away from our goal of a legion, 6,000 friendly neighborhood historians, not violent, friendly neighborhood historians. So really appreciate all of that support and everything. So our topic, hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And today we are going to be discussing one of my favorite historical topics, recommended by one of my loyal Friendly Neighborhood historians. So if you are a Friendly Neighborhood historian and you want to suggest a topic, I'd be down to actually get into it with you guys and do that topic later on. But one of my wonderful subscribers recommended that I talk about CW 225. He recommended the Thank you, Seth. I appreciate that. He recommended that I talk about the French Revolution, which I've talked about on the channel many times. I made several videos about the French Revolution. I've even made a long-form video about the life of Napoleon, one of the most important historical figures who was born out of, a product of, and contributor to that revolution. So we're going to be talking about the French Revolution today, its historical impact, its historical legacy. I've done it on live stream lectures before, but I want to go more in depth. And the more I learn about the French Revolution, the more I actually enjoy exploring it with you guys. So basically, join me as I talk about the history of this extraordinarily important event that has changed life as we know it. The world history, European history, Western history, the world would not be the same without the French Revolution. And why do I say that? Well, hopefully you'll see as I explain the events of the actual French Revolution, but also hopefully you'll see that as I talk about its legacy near the end of the topic. So stay till the end to find out the full legacy of all of that stuff. And if you're enjoying what you're listening to, consider liking and subscribing. You can find the social media handles in the chat from my wonderful moderator, Simon the Bunny. Show him some love and consider that Patreon as well. So the French Revolution really is born out of another revolution, and that is the American Revolution. And the background of this starts in the 1750s. In 1754, Britain and France had been competing for control and influence over North America. The British owned land in the eastern Atlantic seaboard, while the French owned huge parts of what is now the Midwest, the Ohio River Valley territory, which includes the modern U.S. states of Ohio and Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana. So stuff like that. But also, there's so they had that land, which was right next to the British. The French also had extraordinarily good relations throughout their time in colonial America, colonial North America, with the Native Americans. They were less interested in enslaving them and taking their land, and more interested in trading with them and proselytizing them into the Catholic faith via Jesuit missionaries. There were several people, like LaSalle is a great example of this, who came and settled the land and were far less interested in fighting with Native Americans and far more interested in learning from them. So the French actually had by far the best relationship with Native Americans in colonial history. So in the 1750s, the competition between the French and their Indian allies against the British grew more and more stark, especially in Canada. And there was also fighting in India and in Europe at the same time. And eventually, but basically, the French and the British were encroaching on each other's territory. The British were moving more into Western Pennsylvania, Western New York, towards that Ohio River Valley territory, and the French didn't like it. And so the British general, I'm trying to remember his name, Howe, I think it was it Howe? Or Burgoyne? No, those are Revolutionary War generals. But a British general, Bradford, Samuel Bradford, was leading an expeditionary force into the Ohio River Valley with his young American lieutenant who was leading the colonial regulars, a man named George Washington. And they were ambushed by a large number of Indians along with the French and defeated there. And this launched a 9-year war called the French-Indian War, which was part of a larger global war called the 7 Years' War, which starts in Europe in 1756 and lasts until 1763, therefore 7 Years' War, or as I like to call it, World War I. So basically, the truth of the matter is, after this war, the French were heavily defeated and suffered mightily. They lost all of their Canadian territory that they held, which is why large swathes of Canada speaks French to this day. That's why you have French Canadians, Ontario, Quebec. You have a large French Canadian population there, as opposed to the British Anglo-Canadian population. And a lot of and you have a separatist movement in Quebec because of that to this day, who are French Canadians who don't want to be part of an Anglo-centered society that Canada has become. So the British actually gained most of Canada through this war. They gained more influence in India, and they're going to become the predominant European force in India and colonize it in the 19th century. At the same time, the French are going to lose the Ohio River Valley territory to the British, and the British success in this war is going to lead them to tax their American colonies, and their Indian colonies and their native English people at higher rates, especially the Indians in East India that they are now colonizing. The French are really bitter about this. They've lost a huge amount of their colonial influence and power, and they feel that they have been really pushed to the side, and they feel extraordinarily defeated by the results of this conflict. And they think that they would be doing better off if they obviously had won the war. But the loss is devastating to French morale and French prestige. And so for the next decade and a half, they look for an opportunity to get revenge on the British. The revenge comes in the American Revolution, which is caused by that taxation of the American people by the British forces. Now, it is a historical myth that the Americans revolted against the British because taxes were unreasonable and too high to pay. It is actually more true that they revolted against the British because because they had because the taxes were taxed without the Americans having a say in the parliamentary process. There were no Americans in the parliamentary system in Great Britain who could actually speak up and say that they didn't like what was going on. And because of that, they revolted against the British, and their boycotts and rebellions and protests and riots eventually spurred into violence with Lexington and Concord, and that's caused the American Revolution. Now, the French at first want to get involved in this conflict to help the Americans because they think the American cause is just, and they also really want to undermine and hurt the British, along with their allies, long-term allies, the Spanish, to the southwest of them. So the French and the Spanish are interested in helping the Americans during this conflict and weakening the British, but they actually need a good example that the Americans are actually going to be able to win the war. Well, General Henry Knox and Benedict Arnold win a huge victory at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, and this is all the evidence that the American ambassador to France, Great Britain, the colonial ambassador to France, Benjamin Franklin, needs to convince the French government under King Louis XVI to give a lot of money and military aid to the United States. So the French bankroll a large expeditionary force led by a man named the Marquis de Lafayette, who becomes extremely important later in the story, and they help the Americans defeat the British. The Americans are very slow at repaying their debts. Their economy is extraordinarily weak, and although they're an independent nation with a lot of natural resources and a lot of new land, they don't have the monetary funds to pay back the French or compensate them properly, and so the payback of the debt to the French is going to take a long time. No worries, better late than never. Just glad to see everybody here. Hopefully you're all enjoying what I'm talking about and enjoying your Sunday afternoon with me and some friendly history here as I talk about the French Revolution and its impact on history. So I'm still giving the general background about the French Revolution and what's going on. And Rodolfo, my wonderful moderator, is here as well. Please show some love to Simon and Rodolfo and No Step on Snake, my three great moderators in the chat, because they work so hard to make this channel as great as possible. So anyways, back to what we were talking about. So the French are actually bankrupted by this, and a series of famines also weaken their economy. And it's clear by the late 1770s that the French economic system and political system has become extraordinarily weak. They're not getting paid back by the Americans in the 1780s. And so by the late 1780s, it has become obvious that the French people who are starving, their society is weak, their economy is really struggling, and they don't have the international prestige and political might to continually handle their different political issues. And so they've also been organized in a feudal system way too long, with the king having a lot of the power, and there being three estates or three factions of political power, three classes. It's a very classist society, France, in the late 18th century. You have those who pray, the church, which holds a lot of influence and wealth. You have those who work, which are peasants, farmers, businessmen, craftsmen, artisans, the middle class, basically, who represent the middle class and lower classes, and they are later known as the bourgeoisie. That is how Marx, in referring back to the French Revolution, refers to them. And you have those who lead. You have the nobles and the king as basically at the top, overseeing these three different estates: the nobles, the church, and the businesses and the people. And of course, the military is part of the noble gentry. They are under the supervision of the noble gentry, and they are able to hold everything together through force. But basically, what was I going to say? Sorry, I'm blanking on. Excuse me. Basically, Louis the XVI realizes that France's problems are pretty devastating. That helping the Americans defeat the British hurt them, but it didn't actually help the French. And the French are terribly in debt. They don't have a vibrant economy, and they have an extremely classist society that is outdated by several centuries. They don't have democratic representation or liberal democracy. Nothing resembling modern France. Nothing resembling modern Western countries. No parliamentary system really exists in France. It's the king getting the consent of his different nobles as well as the different estates. And whenever the estates meet together, the king has the ability to suspend the estates or to basically tell them no, he doesn't want to do what they want, and he also can demand things from them like taxes. So the Estates General meets whenever the king needs something or something needs to be settled. So the Estates General meets in 1789 with Louis XVI believing he can remedy France's problems, but those who work, which represent the vast majority of the French people and who have the least amount of power, those are the businessmen, the craftsmen, the farmers, the peasants, the landed gentry. These people um, do their best to try to organize a change, and they are the loudest faction, and they are the most irritating to King Louis XVI. So Louis XVI, with the help of the nobles, suppresses them. He actually shuts down the convention. He kicks them out, and he locks the door so they aren't allowed to come in. So the third estate is now left out of the mix of actually trying to solve France's problems, even though all of France's problems are particularly affecting them, and they represent 95 to 98% of the French population. So the king is clearly out of touch with the people. He also doesn't have a desire to really change the way things have been. And the landed gentry and the middle class now have to act on their own. So rather than basically groveling to the king, knowing that desperate change is needed with the French people starving due to several famines and a really weak economy, they basically go across the street to a tennis court and they sign a proclamation on June 30th, 1789, which is usually considered the start date of the French Revolution, called the Tennis Court Oath, where they form an assembly of elected officials and they basically agree to continue to meet until they can remedy the problems of their country. And this is the beginning of the French Revolution in many people's eyes. It starts off as a political movement by people who are more educated and wealthy than the poor that they say they represent. And their agreement is to continue to meet and do what they need to do in order to get France to be in better shape by the end of their meetings. So they continually meet at the tennis court oath. They continually defy the king. And the problem is that the vast majority of the French population is represented by these people. So the king doesn't have the teeth that he thinks that he does. And this prevents him from using the military to crush them. So he is surprised when 2 weeks later, on July 14th, a group of revolutionaries armed themselves by storming a French prison called the Bastille. This is Bastille Day. This is probably the most closest thing to the French 4th of July you can get, where basically the French celebrate the resistance and the revolution. Once again, you have the French, the Third Estate, leading this charge into the Bastille, freeing political prisoners who the king has deemed to be enemies of the state, when they're really just enemies of the king. And you have the king, them gaining a lot of ammunition, weapons, and arms that they can use to resist the military and resist the army and resist the king and his nobles. So now you have a populace that is not only antagonistic against you, not only is subversive to you, but now has organized a military, their own little militia that is actually well armed and could stand up against your regular army. So the king is kind of surprised by this, and there's fighting, and you could call it the first French Civil War that ensues shortly after this. And basically, the king is eventually defeated. His forces are defeated, and he is forced into kind of a house arrest situation in which the Third Estate is able to seize most of the mechanisms of the government, and they begin to reorganize the government along the principles of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a 17th and 18th century philosophical movement, basically mainly made up of political philosophers like John Locke, Voltaire, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who basically advocate certain liberties that most people in the West take for granted today: freedom of religion, freedom of the press, the freedom of the speech. Montesquieu, the famous French nobleman, advocates for a balanced government with chambers, with different legislative chambers, and separation of powers, checks and balances. All of these things that have already worked their way into the American system by this point are inspiring the French revolutionaries in setting up their own governments. And they decide that they will be ruled by reason, that reason is king, and they base this on the thoughts of people like Descartes and Rousseau and Voltaire, and they set up a government with their own Declaration of Independence called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. They defrock the church of most of its political power, and they reorganize. They start closing churches, shutting them down, seizing their assets and their funds, all sorts of different things. Excuse me. And as they do this, as they continually seize money from the church and take its benefits and its land and its property, they are doing this in order to gain more more economic opportunities to fund what they need to fund, which is economic redistribution and basically funding a new government that will be a liberal government that will allow for the election of officials, a parliamentary system. They are going to reorganize France in their own image. Now, the revolutionaries are not all unilateral, and not all of them believe the exact same thing. Some of the revolutionaries, like the Marquis de Lafayette, believe in a constitutional monarchy like the British have, and they want to maintain a constitutional monarchy. There's different types of French revolutionaries who think different types of things and have different perspectives. Some of them want a constitutional monarchy. Some of them want a parliamentary system or some similar to what the Dutch have. Some of them look at the Americans as their role model. There are more radical forms who basically not only want to overthrow the monarchy, but also want to establish a noblest state, basically without an upper class, and where the nobles and the state and the king are punished for being uh, basically in charge. And basically punishing the first estate for all the power it's had and how it has tormented and oppressed the third estate through the centuries, especially the monarchy. So basically, reclamation and repayment and retribution against the monarchy. This wing is pretty radical, and the most radical form of them are known as the Jacobins, who advocate not only political upheaval but political violence. Um, so, the, uh, so basically, the Jacobins are the most radical part of the French Revolution, but they're the most vocal part of the French Revolution, and it's always the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. And so they're able to gain more and more influence. Meanwhile, the king is absolutely furious at him being in house arrest, as is his wife Marie Antoinette. Now, Marie Antoinette is part of the reason that the French revolutionaries are successful, because they're able to display the king as an ineffectual monarch who does not care about the plight of his people, and especially his wife does not care about the plight of his people, which which are not true. Marie Antoinette is hated by the French people, and the revolutionaries take advantage of this, especially in the press, because she is not French. She is Austrian. She is the sister of the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II. And she knows that she can flee to Austria with her husband whenever she wants to. Now, I haven't brought up the famous story of her saying, "Let them eat cake" yet, because apparently when the revolutionaries went to the royal palace demanding food, when a mob of peasants went to the royal palace, inspired by the revolutionaries in the Third Estate, to demand food, she told them, "Oh, let them eat cake, or let them eat bread," pain, the French word pain, or pan. Pan is bread in Spanish. But this never actually happened. This was exaggerated in the press, and there was no evidence of her ever saying such a thing to the mob that tried to storm the palace. So those mobs, used by the Third Estate to overthrow the monarchy and limit its power, basically have trapped the king in the palace. And one night, the king secretly escapes and tries to go to Austria. He is caught and brought back, and that is when the revolutionaries deem not only the king, but the monarchy in general to be a threat to the reason and the liberty of the French Revolution. Speaking of which, they coin a new phrase, a new idea for the French Revolution, a new motto: liberté, equalité, fraternité. Liberty, equality, and fraternity. Freedom, the equality of all people, and the brotherhood of the French people, that we're all a communal people who are all working together for the common good. And these themes are repeated in the Declaration of Man and Citizen, Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which basically defrocks the church of its power, secularizes the society, proclaims all men to be equal, not women, it condemns slavery. They set up a new clock and a new calendar system that is not based on one created by the church, the Gregorian calendar. And so they basically decide that they are going to be a secular society. There is a separation of church and state. In fact, there is a weakening and an undermining of religion in French society, because the revolutionaries, like Voltaire and Rousseau and other Enlightenment philosophers who inspired them, believed that religion had been a weakening influence on society and had stopped the progress of reason and the development of truth and things like this. And so the French revolutionaries are inspired by a more secular model They are inspired by a more secular model of government than the American founders were in their own foundations. Now, many of the American founding fathers, by the way, find the French Revolution, especially as it turns more violent, to be absolutely uproarious. The exception being Thomas Jefferson, who famously says the tree of liberty, the blood must be pruned with the blood of tyrants. Sometimes. I believe something along those lines. I might be misquoting him, but basically, the American revolutionaries aren't huge fans of are fans of the French Revolution until they see the violence that erupts, and the violence that erupts is caused by the Jacobins. And the leader of the Jacobins becomes one of the most outspoken French politicians of all time, Maximilien Robespierre, who basically says that there is no that the public, that the nobles are the enemy, the church is the enemy, the king is the enemy, and everyone associated with the king and anyone who would try to undo what the revolution is doing, counter-revolutionaries, are enemies of the new French state that is being created. So after the king runs away and is brought back, they basically, in the monarchy, they put the king on trial in Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety, which is a group set up basically to terrorize the noble and upper classes and the aristocracy. The Committee of Public Safety declares the king and his wife traitors to the revolution and to the French people, and they execute them. They execute them by a new style of execution known as the guillotine. The guillotine is a wooden frame with a metal block on it at the top, which has a sharp knife-like edge that is pulled by a lever and drops down, decapitating the person who is there. And it didn't always work all the time, which has led to some very, very bizarre moments. But these executions were public spectacles, as executions were throughout the medieval and early modern period. Somebody gets executed, people just go there, and people just go there and get people would go, they would put them down and they would execute them. They would execute them by beheading. They used to use axes and things like this. They would split people apart. They would burn them alive. They would hang them. All of these things, they would draw and quarter them, which is basically where they pulled apart their joints and then dismembered them. These things were all common forms of torture in the medieval and early modern world, and their heads or their body parts were usually put on display as a warning to any revolutionaries, or in this case, counter-revolutionaries. So the king and his wife are executed. The monarchy is done away with. There is no French monarchy anymore, and the French Republic has been born. The first French Republic has been created, and you can date it back, as if you want, to June 30th, 1789, when the Third Estate signed the Tenth Court Oath. But by 1793, 1792, and 1793, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizens have been created. You have a monarchy basically losing all of its prestige because the king tries to run away. How are the French people doing with all of this? Well, they're okay. They think that these new revolutionaries will represent their rights and their ideas. And it doesn't, there's a lot of worry about what's going to happen next and how these things are going to go. But the people generally think that these things are going to be better, and that because the monarch is out of the way and because the nobles who are out of the way, who have been hoarding wealth, that they will be okay. Now, a lot of people in the countryside depend on the church and have a lot of respect for the church, so that's not necessarily popular. Now, meanwhile, the neighbors in Europe are not exactly happy with this, and some of them are licking their chops at the opportunity of a weakened France, believing that the French are weakened because their monarch has been destroyed. Many of the different European powers use this opportunity to invade France or declare war on France. Now, some of them, like the Austrians and Leopold II, want to put the Bourbon family, which is the French royal family, back on the throne and to avenge the deaths of Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette. In fact, they were already fighting with them before. But the Dutch, the British, the Austrians, they all get involved, the Prussians, and there's all different reasons for this. Some of this is political gain. Some of this is restoring monarchy. Some of this is crushing insolent rebels, is what they think the people like the Jacobins are. The Jacobins, meanwhile, start to terrorize anyone who they think is not a pure revolutionary, and basically anyone who is not a pure revolutionary is a Jacobin. Jean-Paul Marat, whose execution is made famous in a painting by the famous French painter of the Revolution, Jacques-Louis David, is a revolutionary, is a famous revolutionary writer. He's killed in his bathtub because he's not revolutionary enough. So the Jacobins, and Robespierre especially, start to go mad with power in 1793 to 1794 and start executing churchmen, nobles, business owners, anyone who they think is a counter-revolutionary, who is a threat to the revolution. And this begins what is known as the Reign of Terror, when the French Revolution really goes off the rails, and even Thomas Jefferson is forced to admit that it's really not going as well as it looked. So the revolution, which began with such high ideals and with such high emphasis on reasoning, has now turned into a violent squabble where basically if you are not a good enough revolutionary, you are going to be killed by the state. And that is starting to terrorize not just the French, but everyone around the world. And people like the Tsarina of Russia, Catherine the Great, see the execution of Louis XVI and turn their back on liberal ideology. So conservatives, nobles, people who want to keep monarchs in power at this time, emerge as a response to this because they basically feel it is a violent overreaction, and they want to keep traditional powers, emperors, kings, queens. They want to keep them in power and keep the military guarding them at all times. And this will lead to the creation of the conservatism of Europe in the 19th century, where monarchies are protected, emperors are protected by the state, by the nobles, by the aristocracy, by the church, and by the military. And this has become popular in places like Austria and Russia and Prussia. But basically, it's a reaction to this, who basically think that the liberal ideas of the Enlightenment have basically not worked out in France, and violence could not possibly be exactly what Rousseau had intended with his idea of the general will of the people, nor had it been in Voltaire's notion when he advocated that the monarchy may not be the best. Um, so I really appreciate that. No Step on Snake, you joining the Patreon. If you are enjoying what you're hearing, by the way, and what we're talking about with the French Revolution, we're halfway through. Consider liking and subscribing here, joining my Patreon, joining my Substack, my social medias, all of that stuff. So, and Nothing to See here is asking, oh, I spent a lot there. How does the French Republic stand up to the threats from outside? That's what I'm going to talk about next. So, the French Republic, France has the largest population in mainland Europe. It is the oldest kingdom, it is the most established monarchy, and it is actually able to stand up to the threats of outside influences, such as the Prussians and the Austrians, who are their main two threats, and the British. And there are different armies and invasions in France, and the French Republic is actually able to defeat them time and time again throughout the 1790s. The French army is well disciplined. It's the strongest at this time, and despite all of the chaos and infighting inside of France, they are able to successfully withstand all of the invasions and attacks from the British and the Austrians and the Prussians, who are trying to simultaneously undo what the French Revolution was doing, while at the same time take a piece out of France and its influence and power on the continent. So the main reason is that by 1794, the French Republic decides to become expansive, and it decides to invade Italy. And they send a young commander named Napoleon Bonaparte, who is Italian. He's from Corsica. Napoleon Bonaparte is how you pronounce his last name, into Italy. And Napoleon soon proves that in an officer corps that has proven steadfastly able to defeat widespread armies throughout all of Europe, in generals and captains and commanders and field marshals who have all proven extraordinarily effective, that he stands out above the rest as being the best officer and leader of the French army. And he becomes the main reason that the French Republic's forces are able to consistently defeat he is a reason why the French Republic's forces are able to continually defeat those forces of the other Europeans, particularly Austria and Prussia. And his invasion of Italy goes extraordinarily well, and he's basically setting them up and knocking them down. And he is the bright spot of the revolution, because by this point, the revolution internally has turned into utter chaos. Robespierre, for instance, is eventually voted by the Committee of Public Safety as an enemy of the state. He is outraged at this, and they come to arrest him. He refuses to be arrested. A man takes out a gun and shoots him. He shoots him in the face. And so they decide that in the spirit of liberty, equality, and fraternity, where all men are created equal and everyone should have trial by jury and everyone should have rule of law and due process, they take this man whose face is hanging open because of a gunshot wound, who is bleeding and screaming in agony, throw him into a court in the Committee of Public Safety, put him on trial, and through due process convict him of being a traitor to the revolution, and then behead him. The same way he had authorized the deaths of thousands of people through the guillotine, he is also executed that way in 1794. And this is seen as the beginning of the end of the Reign of Terror and the Committee of Public Safety, because the committee soon falls apart, because it's obviously gone way far afield of what any revolutionary had ever intended. Robespierre did not expect himself to be beheaded. And I'm sure Robespierre did not wake up one day and just say, hey, let's behead as many people as we possibly can. The continual radicalization of the French Revolution and the Jacobin side gaining more and more influence over more conservative and liberal elements of the revolution had torn France apart, and now the revolution is kind of all over the place. The French Republic is hanging on by a thread, and by the late 1790s, what becomes the actual main sticking point of the French Revolution and its ability to survive, and the reason the First Republic is even hanging on, comes down to one name: Napoleon. Now, Napoleon is not, and in his heart of hearts, a Republican, and I mean Republican with a little r here, not a big R. A Republican in the sense of someone who wants no monarchy and limited government and representative democracy. That's common. The term Republican was used in Italy. It was the people who fought in the Spanish Civil War against the nationalists in Franco were called the Republicans. Republican is a term of government for no monarch and representative government and parliamentarianism that becomes common in Europe in the 19th century. Napoleon is not a Republican. He actually comes from a little bit of Voltaire's model and a little bit of a man named Thomas Hobbes, another Enlightenment philosopher who believed that a strong monarchical despot is needed to control people because of how difficult society is to control. Thank you, I guess. I'm not Greek, but I appreciate that. Anyways, but so Napoleon doesn't really believe in elected democracy, parliamentary process, things like this, but he does believe in the rule of law. He does believe in a new law code, in creating a updated legal version where people are equal under the law, where there's due process, where there's more opportunities for women, where there's educational opportunities, there's universal education. Napoleon is an advocate of universal education. And basically, a lot of the liberal ideas of the French Revolution actually do inspire Napoleon. He likes the idea that all men are created equal. He likes the idea of the freedom of speech. He likes these ideas. As long as he can control them, he likes them. And that is how he will spend the rest of his life, being an ostensible ally to the revolution and believing that he is the continuation of the revolution, while also extraordinarily and doggedly refusing to admit that there's any way in which he has betrayed or countermanded the revolution. But it's obvious as time goes on that he has indeed betrayed and countermanded the revolution. And this is one of the biggest debates in history. Debates in history between historians in writing is called historiography. It is the basic philosophical interpretation of a historical event. For instance, something I talked about in the channel last night is historiographical. Was the Civil War about slavery? People go back and forth about this. One of the big ones about Napoleon, who is my favorite person in history, by the way. I find him to be an absolutely fascinating character. Check out my full-length video on the life of Napoleon and his impact on the world affairs and on the world stage. I've done so many videos on Napoleon. It's not even funny. I've done an entire live stream on Napoleon. He's that fascinating of a guy to me. But Napoleon is basically back and forth this example of the historians arguing of, was he part of the revolution? Was he a continuation of the revolution? Was he a stoppage of the revolution? I think he himself liked the revolution, but he picked and chose what parts of the revolution he wanted to carry over, while at the same time creating a despotic environment with him in control. And again, he was a fan of free speech and free press, but any despotic ruler cannot be fully okay with free speech and free press. He has to put limits on it in one way or another, and that is definitely the case with Napoleon Bonaparte. So, anyways, what happens next? So Napoleon's armies are setting him up and knocking him down, consistently defeating the Italians, the Prussians, the Austrians, basically. But Napoleon knows that the biggest enemy to France's ambitions and to the success of the revolution is the British Empire, with their very formidable navy and with their colonies, especially the colonies in India that they had won over from the French back in the 7 Years' War. Do you see how history causes things? The 7 Years' War, the taxation from that led to the American Revolution. France overdoing it in helping the Americans defeat the British in order to humiliate them, and then not being properly compensated, caused the famines and the economic downturn that led to the French Revolution, which led to Napoleon rising in power and prestige as the only one who could defeat the enemies of the revolution, leading to them once again going after the British, who took those colonies in the first place. It's all connected. It's all part of the same narrative. That's why I didn't start with with Bastille Day. I started with the French and Indian War in 1754, and you could even go back to Columbus if you want to explain all of this, because history is full of connections. It's a tapestry with threads that and colors and patterns, and it doesn't repeat necessarily, but it does rhyme a lot. And I've talked about that a lot here on the channel. So now that I get off of my soapbox, I'm going to go back to what I was talking about with Napoleon. So Napoleon basically feels that the British are the biggest threat to the French and that he should be able to get to India. And if he can get to India, he can actually attack British colonies there and draw their attention away from Europe and really humiliate them. And if he can get the British off of the backs of the French with their navy and their forces, he can win a huge victory against an imperial power, because by this time Britain has become quite an empire with its land holdings in India and North America. And after losing the 13 colonies, they turned their attention to the island of Australia, the island continent of Australia, to be able to put their prisoners basically in, so they don't have to deal with them in Great Britain. Napoleon decides the best way to get to India is to go through Egypt and through the straits there and through the Red Sea. And this means he has to invade the Ottoman Empire, which controls this land. Now, the Ottoman Empire is not what it was in the 16th and 17th century. It has become a weaker form of what it used to be. It is not as strong as it used to be. It's not a formidable threat to the Europeans like it had been in the 1500s and 1600s, but it's still really strong. It still holds a lot of land and is still the predominant Muslim power in the world, and obviously continues to be a threat and an enemy to the Europeans all throughout Central and Eastern Europe, especially. They still hold on to Greece and the Balkans at this time and have enslaved millions of Europeans through the years. So they are seen as a mortal enemy of Europeans, especially those who are more religious. Speaking of which, Napoleon is more religious than most other revolutionaries, and unlike the Jacobins, who are completely secular and more like the Marquis de Lafayette, he is okay with the Catholic Church having a predominant influence on France, because he knows that you need Catholicism and it's integral to the existence of French culture, and that it goes all the way back to Clovis in 495 when he adopted Catholicism. Catholicism in France have been like this for thousands of years, for 1500 years almost, and Napoleon isn't going to necessarily stop that. His invasion of the Ottomans goes well enough. This is, by the way, where his cannoneers blow off the Sphinx's nose. That's where that happened. The British help the Ottomans and basically are able to Napoleon is forced to eventually turn back, but he does deal significant amounts of damage to the Ottomans and to the British. And he will spend a huge amount of time focusing on how to break Britain's naval hold, but he will never be able to outdo them. The British Navy is always going to be stronger than him. By the time he gets back to France, there's more chaos in the revolution. Basically, different factions are fighting over power and control over the Republic, and Napoleon basically has the army completely loyal to him because he's won so many doggone battles and he's defeated so many of their foes that he is basically the most powerful man in France because he has the army behind his side. Once again, the ability to have weaponry and an army that could fight for you, just like the militia created from the Bastille by the Third Estate, allows for you to be able to dominate the narrative. It's the same thing in the American Revolution. So basically, yeah, Doggy Boy, I do remember that. I mean, I love Samurai Jack. That just takes me back. Gendy Tartakovsky, what a great guy. But anyways, so Napoleon goes back. This is before he got to Samurai Jack. He goes back to the French Republic, and basically he tells them, I have all the power. I have all the tools. I have all the weapons in my arsenal. It's my turn. This isn't working anymore. We need something a little bit stronger. And he sets up a consulate. And the consulate is a council, an oligarchy of him and his trusted advisors, but they're all people that he approves of. He gets rid of the old calendar. He kind of accepts the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and he basically becomes a dictatorial like status. But he basically rides back the more radical elements of the revolution while also embracing some of its elements, such as universal equality, educational opportunities, freedom of speech. The separation of church and state is big for Napoleon, but his biggest focus is on using these revolutionary and Enlightenment philosophies to apply to the rule of law. And so Napoleon creates the Napoleonic Law Code, which is the greatest law code created since Justinian's Code in the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century. And the Napoleonic Law Code is so thorough and so precise that it is still used as one of the major law codes in the world. It's one of the most successful endeavors in creating law, and it is applying the rule of process, the no one being above the law, all of these things that were part of the rule of law, due process, these things uh, to all strata of society where no one is above the law. Everybody has to pay back what they do wrong. Nobles cannot get away with things. Kings cannot get away with things. This throws out the idea of l'état c'est moi from Louis XIV, I am the state, and it basically puts absolutism on its deathbed in France. Well, Napoleon himself, due to his military successes, is becoming more and more the absolute ruler of the French people. So, what happens to the French Revolution? Well, it's swallowed up in the Napoleonic years. From then on, Napoleon is going to be the main determiner of the French Revolution. Now, as he conquers significant portions of Europe, defeating coalition armies after coalition armies, and the coalition armies, they called them that because they were a bunch of different European countries, the Austrians, the Prussians, the Russians, the British, that would throw together all of their forces and basically do everything they could to stop the French. And usually they failed mightily. And Napoleon was able to defeat them over and over again. And every time he defeated them, he took more land, more resources, more wealth. His armies got bigger, and the different kingdoms got weaker. Austria and Prussia, basically by 1810, basically have to do whatever Napoleon says. A great example of this comes when he defeats Leopold II's forces and basically takes over what is now Germany and reorganizes it along revolutionary ideals, and dissolves the Holy Roman Empire, basically saying that the Holy Roman Empire is superfluous and unnecessary, and it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, like Voltaire said. And Napoleon says, I will be the emperor. So this doesn't sound like a revolution at all. In fact, and it doesn't sound like the French Republic, it doesn't sound like republicanism at all. In fact, when Napoleon created the French consulate in 1799, this is actually considered the ending, after almost a decade, of the first French Republic. There have been 5. God knows how many there will be in history. But basically, Napoleon undoes it, and well, you could say the consulate lasts until 1804. By 1804, Napoleon feels that he has successfully defeated his enemies enough. He has brought the Prussians and the Austrians to heel. He has defeated, I think, 3 or 4 coalition armies by this point, that he basically says, I am the state and I am going to be the emperor in Europe. So in 1804, Napoleon decides to crown himself the emperor of Europe, or the French emperor, and that he creates the first French Empire, ending the first French Republic. And similar to his hero Charlemagne, who 1,000 years ago was crowned in a cathedral in I don't know if they had Notre Dame back then, but Napoleon is crowned in Notre Dame, um, or was it Chartres? It was one of those two. There's Our Lady of Chartres and there's Notre Dame, the two major cathedrals in France built during the Middle Ages. But basically, Napoleon decides that he will be crowned. He has the Pope there. I think it's Leo the Ninth. I don't know which Napoleon, which Leo it is. He has the Pope there, and everyone is expecting the Pope to put the crown on his head, just like Charlemagne 1,000 years earlier. But Napoleon, a son of the Enlightenment, a son of reason, a man who believes in the separation of church and state, who believes in the power of the individual and an individual autonomy, takes the crown from the Pope and puts it on his own head, then takes the other crown and crowns his wife, Josephine, the love of his life. So Napoleon has undone so much of the French Revolution, while also continually doubling down on many of its principles and spreading those principles to other countries. Many of the countries where Napoleon's influence spreads, like Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, what is now Belgium, the principles of a national state, a self-determination, liberal democracy, become entrenched in their politics. And this is how they start to develop parliamentary systems, but also develop the desire for a national identity. So in a way, Napoleon helps create Germany. He helps create Italy. Um, well, he invades Spain and puts his brother on the throne, which causes a civil war. All of the Spanish colonies revolt, which eventually leads to them getting um, their own independence. Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia. These areas become independent because Napoleon. The Spanish are distracted fighting Napoleon, and they can't control their land anymore. The Portuguese king is forced to flee to Brazil, and basically the Brazilians hate him so much that they ask his son to become emperor and ask to be free of the Portuguese. So Napoleon inadvertently causes revolution and the spread of nationalism and liberal ideas all throughout the Western world. It's quite a fascinating thing to see. I don't think that he fully intended it that way, but he did believe that he was a son of the revolution and that he was bringing the revolution to places like Germany, which he calls the Confederation of the Rhine, to the Netherlands, which already had a history of republicanism, didn't have a monarch really, and to Italy and to all the other places. So wherever he went, the ideals of the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Law Code, church and state separation, all of these things go with him. In fact, even though the Russians are the ones who notoriously defeat Napoleon in 1812, the Russian officer corps who saw Napoleon's ideals and the way that monarchies shared power and the limits of monarchical and imperial power through parliamentary systems in Europe bring that back, and that causes a century of revolution in Russia that will end with the Bolshevik communists taking over. So once again, history is all connected. It's all together. It's all pieced together. In fact, communism itself is a product of the French Revolution because Marx is commenting on the French Revolution and where it went wrong and where it went right, in his opinion, in Capital and the Communist Manifesto. In Marx's eyes, the French bourgeoisie, the third estate, they had a revolution and created a liberal democracy that was capitalistic, and that created the French republics of the 19th century. Basically the old feudal system and the monarchical system was overthrown by liberal democracy. Liberal democracy will be overthrown by socialism, which will be overthrown by communism, or at least evolve into communism in Marx's perspective. So they're all connected to each other. The French Revolution, if you're not seeing the legacy, you should see the legacy, hopefully. Marxism comes from the French Revolution. Napoleon comes out of the French Revolution. Europe's entire structure of power has changed. The undermining of the Spanish and Portuguese empires that leads to the independence of the Latin countries is an inadvertent result of the French Revolution. So it's not so as interesting and fascinating as the violence and the reign of terror is, the overthrowing of the monarchy, the let them eat cake myth, which I've talked about before on the channel, all of these different things. What started as a simple revolution because the king would not give them the power that they needed eventually led to the people of France overthrowing the monarch, killing him, and spreading the French Revolution throughout most of the Western world, at least some of its ideas. And the Napoleonic Law Code has become the symbol of that. None of that is an inevitable cause, but it is caused directly or indirectly by the French Revolution. Meanwhile, getting back to Napoleon has the biggest thorn in his side, which are the British. I'll wrap up the live stream by talking about Napoleon's story and how the French Revolution ends. And there's several French revolutions, by the way. There's one in 1830, there's one in 1848, there's one in 1871, where I believe Cito meant this one. This is the one I'm talking about. I can talk about those revolutions another time. I don't know as much about them, but they are very, very interesting parts of history and obviously have their own effects. But basically, the French, Napoleon is setting him up, knocking him down, but his biggest target is the British. And he basically forces whoever he defeats, the Prussians and the Austrians, and eventually the Russians, to enter what he calls the continental system. The continental system is where he and his puppet states and his forced allies, like the Austrians, Prussians, and Russians, basically are forced to not trade with Great Britain and to embargo with Great Britain. Now, Great Britain has a lot of trade. It has a large navy, and not being able to trade with them is devastatingly is tarnishing to these economies. But obviously, Napoleon wants the main conduit of trade to run through France. And so he sets up a system where they are dependent on French economics and French trade and French commercialism rather than the British. However, this doesn't satisfy the Russians. Napoleon, by the way, did try to break the British naval power at the famous Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, but his defeat at the hands of Lord Nelson, who was killed in the endeavor, basically sends him into a tizzy and basically proves to him that he can never defeat the British. He has a whole army aligned at Boulogne, and he just realizes that the fortifications of the English coastline are too strong. The Royal Navy is too strong. And in order to break their power, he has to weaken their economy and basically force them to play ball with him. And that's how he's ever going to be able to defeat the British. So Napoleon never really got his way with the British. Eventually, Tsar Alexander I refuses to end trading with the British. And in 1811, he goes back on the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. And it leaves the continental system, starts trading with Britain again, and Napoleon responds with force. He builds a massive army, the Grande Armée, 500,000 men, never seen before in European history up to that point, and marches across Europe and invades Russia. The invasion is quite interesting because a lot of people think about it. Oh, Napoleon was such a fool. It made sense. The Russians do not have the manpower to answer the French. Now, at this point, throughout most of its history, Russia has always had the reputation of being backwards and insignificant and insufficient. At this point, Russia is actually pretty strong. It's considered the strongest, if not second to the French in Europe, and the Russians are considered far more powerful than the Prussians or the Austrians or maybe even the British. So Napoleon knows that he's going to need a large fighting force. He wouldn't have assembled 500,000 men if he didn't know it was going to be difficult. However, he's defeated coalition armies before, and this is just the Russians. He can do it, and his main goal is the Russian cultural capital of Moscow. Moscow is the most ancient and important city, or one of the most ancient and important cities in all of the Russian land. If he can take Moscow, he can break the will of the Russians. That's his goal. The Russians respond in a fascinating way, which they have done many times in their history. Napoleon invades, the Russians start burning everything. They literally set fire to all the farms and all the land, making sure that Napoleon would have to stretch his supply lines as much as possible, while also the Russian army just retreats. Basically, the Russian army retreats again and again and again until finally, at the fields of Borodino, right near Moscow, they decide they can no longer retreat. Napoleon's 500,000 men meet a Russian force of 125,000, and it's an inconclusive, violent battle, one of the most violent in European history. It's devastating, and basically, it's now. By the way, Napoleon invaded in the summer. It's now September, and the Russians are defeated at Borodino. They don't have enough manpower to withstand the Grande Armée, and Napoleon is basically able to advance on Moscow. He gets to Moscow and he waits for Alexander to surrender. Alexander does something very interesting. A very religious man, he decides to make a sacrilege, a sacrifice, a burnt offering to the Lord, and him and the Russian people set fire to Moscow. They burn the city to the ground, as much of it as they possibly can. And Napoleon, shocked that the Russians would do such a thing, is forced to has no recourse. He's not going to continue to plunge himself deeper and deeper into Russia. His supply lines are already exhausted, and St. Petersburg is a fortress on the Neva River that's going to be extremely hard to take. That's the Russian capital, and Alexander has been incredibly tactful. So what is he going to do? Well, he's going to retreat. Napoleon, this invasion seemed to be a slam dunk. It seemed to be going very well. Borodino was successful. Now he has to retreat. He has to pull back to get to his supply lines by the Polish border. This is when Alexander, using the Russian winter, which sets in nasty and hard, calls upon the Russian people basically to form guerrilla squadrons to attack not guerrilla as in monkey, guerrilla as in guerrilla warfare, guerrilla squadrons that undermine and attack the French forces all the way to the Polish border. And by the time Napoleon reaches Poland, he has 25,000 men left of 500,000. They are devastated. He's lost all of his cavalry. He's lost all of his supplies. He's lost all of his equipment. He is in bad shape, and he retreats backward. And Alexander doesn't stop. He rallies the Prussians and the Austrians. They form a final coalition. They defeat Napoleon, throw him out of power, and dispose him. And then after that, they set up a power. And because of all of the chaos for 25 years in French history, there is now the need to set up a new political system that is basically conservative, that will not tolerate such revolutionary behavior that got so wild with the Jacobins. And this basically sets up a constitutional monarchy in France where the Bourbons are brought back. With a man named Louis the 18th. There was Louis the 17th who ruled briefly in 1793, and he didn't really do anything. But Louis the 18th, and a man named Clemens von Metternich, who is the prime minister of Austria, is going to set up a new political system that relies on keeping the monarchs in power and making sure that no one European power, be it the Austrian Habsburg Empire, be it the British Empire, the French constitutional monarchy, or the Russians, get too powerful. And for a century, basically, the Europeans are going to agree not to have huge land grabs in Europe like Napoleon did anymore. There will be wars and grabbings here and there, but basically, whenever a European power gets too full of itself, other European powers go in to stop it, like in the Crimean War. So this is going to set up a conservative system that basically allows monarchs to stay on their thrones. However, nationalism mixed with liberalism, inspired by the French Revolution and Napoleon spreading it throughout Europe, is going to undermine this time and time again. And you're going to see the formation of new states like Germany and Italy. That might not have happened without the French Revolution. At the same time, Napoleon, in exile, sees the Europeans working in Austria to reorganize, and he basically decides that he's going to make one last show of it. He escapes from Elba. He doesn't have any men. He doesn't have any forces. He arrives in France, The forces of the new constitutional monarchy surround him. He rips open his jacket and yells at them, "I am your emperor. Will you strike me?" They refuse to do so. In fact, they go over to his side and he mobilizes his forces. Knowing that the Europeans will quickly descend upon him, he decides to make an incursion into what is now Belgium, and he meets the British Duke of Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo, who is backed up by the Prussian Field Marshal Blucher, and they are able to defeat Napoleon at Waterloo and send him into exile, where he dies right off the coast, I think, of South America, St. Helena, and that is where he will die several years later. So the French Revolution is basically, I included the story of Napoleon because most people throw that in. Basically, it's part of the learning of the French Revolution. And basically, the truth of the matter is that yes, Napoleon is part of the French Revolution. How much of the revolution is he, and how much of a traitor to the revolution is he? I think it's a mixed, complicated bag where you have both good and bad from a revolutionary perspective. But Napoleon is a fascinating character because he is so politically progressive, but also because he is so politically repressive. Um, and so that's what we're looking at with the French Revolution. And basically, there is a constitutional monarchy set up that will be able to hold on to power on and off for the next 30 years. And the French Republic's experiment seems to have failed, at least for now. So that is a quick history about the French Revolution and what actually happened between the fall of the French influence in North America in the 1750s, 60s, all the way through to the collapse of Napoleon in 1814 and 1815. So hopefully you all enjoyed learning about that and enjoyed the history of the French Revolution and Napoleon. Dub, I hope I gave you exactly what you wanted, and I hope you really enjoyed that topic. If you liked what you learned about and you haven't liked and subscribed, please do so. If you haven't looked at my Patreon, please do so as well. Yeah, you've also got the Substack and all of that. So yeah, I am basically done at this point. I will take. If anyone has any questions about the French Revolution, I'd be happy to take them. I'm going to look through the chat right now and just see how everyone was doing. It seems like we had some nice talks in the chat, and I appreciate Simon and Rodolfo and No Step for holding on. Make sure to subscribe to No Step's channel. He's doing some really great stuff about Pearl Harbor and about World War II. He wants to focus on that for his history, and I think that's fantastic. We really, really appreciate having him here and all that he brings. Yeah, and I see Seth, I see Spills, I see Janet. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate that. Yep, Doggy Boy, I did talk about that. Napoleon exile and come back. The comeback kid. I mean, Napoleon's just fascinating in so many ways. Um, yeah, nothing is ever free, is it really, Ryan? Dudes in a smoker's coat talking history while I'm setting fireworks off on YouTube short. That's fine with me. Hey, we all got to do something to survive. I want to see your YouTube shorts where you blow up fireworks. John Adams is actually the one who called for the Americans to blow up fireworks. Fireworks were common for weddings, for the birth of children in European royal families. Fireworks were common displays of celebration ever since the Europeans first traded for them from the Chinese. And it is not true, by the way, that the Chinese only use fireworks for celebration and gunpowder. They did use it in warfare, but the Europeans perfected the use of gunpowder in weaponry. So, um, yeah. Let me see here. Just going through the chat. But yeah, if you enjoyed learning about the French Revolution and everything, like, subscribe. Think about reading my Substack. Think about becoming a friendly historian on Patreon or best friendly historian. Like and subscribe. Check out my full length content. My videos on the Christmas Carol are now available. I'll be compiling them into a playlist you guys can all listen to. And I've got playlists on the French. I'm going to do French monarchs at some point, and that'll include another video on Napoleon. Right now, I am starting a new series tomorrow, a new short series. We were doing powerful female rulers. We're going to be doing a short series on Chinese imperial dynasties. We're going to start with the Xia, the legendary dynasty that people believe is mythical, but the Chinese sure don't. So look forward to seeing that. And those are short videos, but yeah, interesting stuff to come here in the channel. And maybe we'll get to French monarchs eventually. There's just so many of them. I'd probably start with Pepin the Short and Charles Martel and go all the way to Napoleon, something like that. Maybe even Napoleon III, who used another French Revolution in the 1840s to take power and then was thrown out in the final French Revolution of 1871 just because the French had revolutions because it was the 19th century. Yeah. Money under the mattress. That's a funny thing. Yep. I love the smoking jacket. It's gonna be my continual regalia. It'll be my winter, spring regalia, and when it gets too hot, I will stop wearing it and pick something else, but we wanted to go more formal. We're classing things up. We've got the microphone, we've got the lighting, we've got all of that. I am sick and tired of this Blair, by the way. Yeah, maybe that's a little nicer for you guys. But, yes. I know, Rodolfo, you want to save a gap. I am going to use any money to get a Patreon, but I promise not to use any money you give me, and it costs a lot anyways. So, um, just joking around here. Platinus is saying Metternich was also against the Greek Revolution of 1821. He saw it as a threat to the established. Yes, Metternich basically wanted to hold everything in his hands and hold it in power. And basically, the Ottomans were seen as a weakening power. The sick man of Europe is what the Russians called them in the 19th century, but they didn't want to cause more chaos and trouble, a la the French Revolution in Greece. But the Greek Revolution was a nationalist revolution, and it's really I read recently that it's where nationalism started was in Greece. With that revolution that eventually saw Greece become independent of the Ottomans and was the beginning of the end of the Ottoman control of southeastern Europe, and maybe even the beginning of the end of the Ottoman Empire in 1832. So, yeah, Waterloo is a fascinating story. I really appreciate that you appreciated it, Seth. I always appreciate you being here. Ever happy dude. So great to see you. Thank you, doggy boy. You are also cool, respectful, and smart. What's wrong with the mic, Adam? Yeah, that sounds about right. If I want to get monetized, I'm going to have to stream 24/7. Yeah, I want to put up the I want to put what happened a few weeks ago? Was that because I think I had it on my shirt and it was making a lot of scratchy noises as I moved around. But basically, I'm enjoying the new mic setup because I'm trying to get a little bit more professional here. Maybe I need a better one still. But Adam, if you subscribe to the Patreon, maybe that'll help me afford an even nicer mic that'll make it easier. I want to get a studio at some point. I like this background. I like this cozy feel of being in my living room. But yeah. Um, my dissertation, I haven't written one yet, but it's my master's thesis. Will put on my Substack at some point, probably in the next couple of weeks, where I talk about the great game between Russia and Afghanistan. I am also thinking about doing a TikTok, so I'll probably put up a poll on the channel there. I'm not sure exactly uh, how that's going to work, but I'm going to do my best to do that in maybe the next couple of uh, weeks to figure out if I want to do a TikTok. I'm going to post my master's thesis, so there's going to be a lot of reading, and I just want this to be as multimedia as possible. I'm doing narration, I'm branching out, I'm becoming more eclectic. We're getting writing, we're getting blogging. I did a lot of eclectic stuff, talking about politics and the political election when I knew it'd be historical. Christmas Carol is historical. It's public domain, easy to read. I did a reading of that. I did a reading of Twas the Night Before Christmas. So if you're still in the holiday spirit and you're still celebrating Christmas, or you just like holiday stuff in general, go ahead and do that. Christmas lasts technically until tomorrow with Epiphany, which is 3 holidays all in one. It is the celebration of the Orthodox Church following the Julian calendar, which in Russia, for instance, will celebrate Christmas. The Christians, it is also the day of what's called Epiphany, when supposedly Jesus of Nazareth was named Jesus in the temple. And it is lastly also the Dia de los Tres Reyes, is supposedly when the wise men got to Jesus, popularly celebrated in Latin culture and things like that. Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if anyone's gonna miss me, but for now, I'm doing what I can here, and I'm gonna miss all of you guys. Until we get back next Friday, where we'll be doing another Q&A. So join us next Friday and Saturday at our normal times. And next Sunday, does anyone have a preliminary topic they want me to think about doing for next Sunday? Uh, I like it when the channel recommends topics because it gets me more engaged with the people here and I get to hear them. It's not just me determining every single thing about this channel. This is a community channel, liberty, equality, fraternity. Am I right? So, but let me know if you guys have a particular topic you would like me to go over for next weekend. Joey saying, what are your goals in life? Are you going to try to be a teacher or a professor? I'd like to be a professor. I'd like to do my dissertation, but the YouTube world has really brought me in. Patreon has really brought me in. Substack. So there's a lot there. Um, I'll miss you until next week. I'll miss you too, Seth. Charles Cromwell? You mean Oliver Cromwell? Spanish War, 1900s? You mean the Spanish Civil War? Those are two very good topics. In fact, I think I can talk about them in a half hour each and do both. If you're referring to Oliver Cromwell, there's Thomas Cromwell, there's Oliver Cromwell, there's a lot of Cromwells. The Spanish American War of 1898. I can talk about that. That's a good one. White Banana. Maybe we talk a lot about Islam and Christianity. Maybe talk a bit on Jewish history. Well, if you want, I've done that a lot. Last week's live stream was supposed to be the French Revolution, but I did an entire hour talking about the history and significance of Hanukkah. Please check that out and my video on the history of Hanukkah. I talk about a lot of Jewish history, a lot of Judaism on this channel. Isn't that right, Simon? I mean, sometimes I feel like I talk about that sometimes too much, but if you want to learn more about Jewish history and Judaism, please check those things out, White Banana. Yeah. Please, yes, thank God you're joking, Simon. Yeah, Spanish American War. That's a good one. I can do the Spanish American War. And I think I could do Cromwell, and so I think we're going to do Oliver Cromwell and the British. You know what? We'll do two wars: the English Civil War and Oliver Cromwell. And the first half, maybe that'll take a half hour, which wasn't the English Revolution, if you want to think about it. So I guess we're learning about more revolutions, and the Caribbean Revolution, where the United States helped the Puerto Ricans, the Philippines, and the Cubans get their Puerto Ricans, the Filipinos, and the Cubans get their independence. So we're going to talk more about revolutions next week, wars, and politics. So it's going to be similar in some ways, but hopefully we can get to two topics in one. The American Civil War. Why did we go to war? What states weren't Confederate? What was simply... So Joey, there's 4 border states that had slaves that stayed in the Union and didn't really fight. Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland. And they were border states. And there were actually 8 of them, but Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, and Arkansas, I think, joined the Confederacy after Fort Sumter. Yes. There you go, Simon. I mean, of course, I know, but you would never go down that route. It was a good joke. It was a good joke. Yeah. So yeah, White Banana. Check out some of the stuff I've talked about with Jewish history and culture, and I talk about it all the time on the Q&As and the Ask Me Anything, because people come in and want to know my opinion about the history of Israel and Palestine. So I talk about that a lot. And yes, Viva la France. I hope you all enjoyed that. Bienvenue, or that's welcome. But welcomings are always available. But I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I will see you back here on Friday. A bon nuit to you all. Good night, and I will look forward to... And yes, the Holocaust Memorial Day, I'm probably going to make... I think it's the 25th. I'm going to probably make a video about that. Tomorrow is January 6th. I will be making a video about Epiphany, but I will also be talking about in my History of Today video, which I do every day. Check those out if you'd like to. The history of January, and of course what happened 5 years ago at the U.S. Capitol. Hard to believe that was 4 years ago. Why am I always thinking 5? 4 years ago. But thank you, everyone. A bon nuit to you all, and take care. Viva la France and la Révolution. Goodbye now. Or should I say...